Fear paralyzed every single patron inside that greasy night diner as a dying man collapsed beside a glowing jukebox. They recognized his aristocratic face instantly. Terrified, nobody moved to help this bleeding mafia boss. Nobody except one heavy-set night waitress who stepped forward and looked him in the eye. Rain lashed against the greasy front windows of Pappy's 24/7 eatery on the outskirts of South Philadelphia, distorting the neon sign into a bleeding red smear. Inside the diner smelled of stale coffee, burnt hash browns, and cheap disinfectant. Penelope Higgins hated that smell, but it paid the rent. Penelope was a big woman. At 290 pounds, she was acutely aware of the space she took up in the narrow aisles between the vinyl booths. Her pale pink uniform was uncomfortably snug across her broad shoulders and heavy thighs, and the strings of her apron barely managed to tie around her thick waist. Customers usually looked right through her, treating her like a piece of the furniture, a soft, fat, invisible machine meant only to deliver pancakes and refill mugs. She was used to the snickers from a table of teenagers, the condescending smirks from businessmen, and the constant biting remarks from her manager Stan, who always told her she moved too slow. But Penelope didn't care what they thought. She had a kind heart, a sharp mind, and a secret past wrapped up in the memories of her late Sicilian grandmother, who had taught her that a person's worth wasn't measured by their waistline, but by the iron in their spine. At 2:14 a.m., the brass bell above the diner door didn't just ring. It violently smashed against the glass as the heavy oak door was kicked open. The late-night chatter abruptly died. The clinking of silverware stopped. A man staggered into the diner. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke, charcoal-grey Brioni suit that was soaked with rain and something much darker. His face, aristocratic and sharp, was pale as parchment. He gripped his abdomen, blood oozing between his fingers and spilling onto the floor in thick, heavy droplets. Penelope recognized him instantly, and by the collective gasp that sucked the air out of the room, so did everyone else. It was Matteo Rossi. He was the undisputed head of the Rossi crime syndicate, a man who owned half the judges in the city, and had a reputation so ruthless that people crossed the street when they saw his black Lincoln Navigator approaching. The local news had been buzzing for weeks about a vicious turf war between the Rossis and the rival Moretti family. Tonight it seemed the war had spilled onto Broad Street. Matteo took 2 agonizing steps forward and collapsed against a corner booth, sliding down the cracked vinyl until he hit the floor with a heavy thud. He left a smeared trail of crimson down the side of the table. Panic erupted, silent and cowardly. A trucker at the counter threw a $20 bill on the Formica, grabbed his jacket, and bolted out the back exit. 2 college students abandoned their milkshakes and scrambled out the front door, avoiding the bleeding mafia boss like he was radioactive. Stan, the manager, let out a pathetic squeak and ducked behind the cash register, frantically locking the metal grate over the till and crouching on the floor, trembling. No one moved to help him. To touch Matteo Rossi was to invite the wrath of whoever had just put a bullet in his gut. Matteo's vision was blurring. The edges of the diner were fading into black. He could hear the rain outside and the cowardly shuffling of footsteps as the last few patrons abandoned him to die on a dirty diner floor. He coughed a wet, rattling sound, tasting copper in the back of his throat. He had been set up. His own capo had sold him out to the Morettis. "Aiutami!" Matteo rasped the word slipping out in his native tongue as his mind regressed to his childhood in Palermo through the haze of blood loss. "Help me." He expected silence. He expected the cold embrace of death on a cheap linoleum floor. Instead, he heard the heavy, deliberate squeak of rubber-soled nurse shoes. Penelope didn't run away. While Stan cowered and the rest of the world turned a blind eye, Penelope dropped her coffee pot. The Pyrex shattered brown liquid splashing across the tiles, but she didn't care. She moved with a surprising grounded urgency, her large frame dropping heavily to her knees beside the bleeding Don. Mio Dio. Penelope whispered her hands, hovering over his ruined suit. Matteo's eyes fluttered open. He looked up at the round, fleshy face of the waitress. Her cheeks were flushed red, her double chin prominent as she looked down at him, but her brown eyes were fiercely intelligent and completely devoid of fear. "Signore mi sente?" Penelope asked, her voice steady, and her Sicilian dialect absolutely flawless. "Sir, can you hear me?" Matteo blinked, shocked. The last thing he expected in a run-down Philly diner was a fat American waitress speaking perfect unaccented Italian. "Tranquillo, ci penso io." Penelope continued her tone, authoritative yet deeply soothing. "Calm down, I'll take care of it." They are coming," Matteo choked out in English, coughing up a fleck of blood onto his chin. "Moretti's men. They followed." Penelope didn't hesitate. Society might have written her off as a slow, lazy woman, but they didn't know the sheer physical strength she possessed. She had spent years carrying the weight of the world and her own body without breaking. "Stan!" Penelope roared, her voice booming through the diner. "Get out from behind that counter and help me lift him! Are you crazy, Penny?" Stan shrieked from the floor. "That's Rossi. If they find us with him, we're dead. Leave him." "You cowardly piece of garbage," Penelope spat. She looked back down at Matteo. "All right, Mr. Rossi. This is going to hurt like hell, but you need to help me. On 3, you push, I pull." Penelope grabbed Matteo by the lapels of his ruined $1,000 suit. She planted her thick legs using her low center of gravity and her substantial weight as leverage. "Uno, due, tre." With a mighty heave, Penelope yanked upward. Matteo let out a stifled roar of agony, his boots scrambling for purchase. Despite his 200-pound frame of pure muscle, Penelope hoisted him up, throwing his heavy arm over her wide shoulders. She wrapped her thick arm around his waist, pressing her soft side against his bleeding ribs, acting as a human crutch. "Walk!" she commanded. Together the bleeding Mafia boss and the fat diner waitress stumbled toward the back hallway, just as the screech of tires echoed from the parking lot outside. The heavy steel door of the walk-in freezer slammed shut behind them, cutting off the ambient noise of the diner and plunging them into near-freezing darkness, save for the single flickering fluorescent bulb overhead. Penelope eased Matteo down onto a stack of cardboard boxes filled with frozen French fries. He groaned his head, lolling back against the frost-covered aluminum wall. His breath plumed in the frigid air. "Hold this," Penelope ordered, grabbing a stack of clean, heavy-duty bar towels from a prep shelf just outside the door before she had closed it. She balled them up and pressed them hard against the gunshot wound in his lower left abdomen. Matteo hissed his fingers, gripping her thick wrist with surprising strength. You speak like my mother," he managed to say, his dark eyes locking onto hers, studying the sweat beading on her forehead, despite the cold. "My nonna was from Palermo," Penelope said briskly, not pulling her hand away. "She taught me the old language. Taught me not to walk away when someone's bleeding out like a stuck pig, either. Keep the pressure on." Matteo obeyed his hand, covering hers, pressing the towels into his flesh. He watched her move. She was out of breath, her large chest heaving, but she didn't look panicked. She looked angry. She grabbed a roll of industrial duct tape from a utility shelf in the corner. Suddenly, the muffled sound of the diner's front door being kicked open echoed through the heavy walls of the freezer. Matteo went entirely still. Penelope froze the duct tape in her hand. They could hear heavy footsteps out in the dining area, voices loud and aggressive. "Where is he?" a rough voice barked. It was Dante, one of the Moretti family's most notorious hitmen. Penelope could hear Stan crying. "I don't know. He just walked in and then went out the back. I swear to God, you're lying, you greasy little rat. There's blood on the floor. It stops at the hallway." Inside the freezer, Matteo reached into his shoulder holster, his movements agonizingly slow. He pulled out a sleek black Glock 19, but his hands were shaking so violently from blood loss and the freezing temperature that he nearly dropped it. Penelope gently took the gun from his trembling hands. "What are you doing?" Matteo whispered, his voice barely a breath. "You can't even hold it," Penelope whispered back, slipping the heavy firearm into the deep, wide pocket of her pink uniform apron. It weighed her down, but she didn't flinch. "I'm going out there." "No," Matteo commanded, coughing weakly. "They will kill you. You are just a woman." Penelope looked down at him, a bitter, sad smile touching her lips. "Mr. Rossi, look at me. Look at my size. Men like that, they don't see me as a threat. They don't see me as a woman. They don't see me at all. I'm just a fat fixture in a diner. I'm invisible." Before Matteo could stop her, Penelope turned and cracked the freezer door open, slipping out into the back hallway and pulling the heavy steel door completely shut behind her. She took a deep breath, instantly altering her posture. She let her shoulders slump, widened her eyes to look terrified and stupid, and waddled out into the main dining area, holding a dirty mop she grabbed from the utility closet. Dante and another thug, a massive bruiser named Carmine, had Stan pinned against the pie display case. Dante held a snub-nosed revolver pressed under Stan's chin. "I'll ask you one more time," Dante growled. "Where is Rossi?" "Oh, my lord!" Penelope shrieked, dropping the mop with a loud clatter. The two hitmen spun around, aiming their weapons at her. Penelope threw her hands up her thick arms, trembling. She forced tears into her eyes, making herself look as pathetic, frightened and helpless as possible. "Please don't shoot. I just work here. I'm just the night girl." Dante looked her up and down, his lip curling in obvious disgust. He took in her stained pink uniform, her flushed round face, and her heavy frame. Just as Penelope predicted, his eyes immediately registered her as worthless a non-threat. "Shut up, Shamu," Carmine sneered, lowering his gun slightly. "Where's the guy in the suit who just came in here?" He ran," Penelope stuttered, pointing a chubby finger toward the back exit door that led to the alley. "He was bleeding all over my freshly mopped floor. He came down the hall, cursed at me in some foreign language, and went right out the emergency exit into the alley. Please just take the money in the register. Don't hurt me, I have a cat." Stan stared at her, utterly bewildered, but Dante pressed the barrel harder into his neck, she telling the truth. Yes," Stan sobbed. "Yes, he went out the back." Dante shoved Stan away in disgust. He looked at Carmine. "Alleyway, go. He can't have gotten far with a hole in his gut." Carmine sneered at Penelope one last time. "Clean up the mess, pork chop," he spat, before the two men sprinted down the hallway, blowing past the walk-in freezer, and kicked open the heavy emergency exit, charging out into the rainy alley. The second the door slammed shut behind them, Penelope's terrified facade vanished. Her face hardened into stone. She didn't wait for Stan to say a word. She moved with shocking speed for a woman her size, rushing back to the kitchen and ripping open the freezer door. Matteo had slipped unconscious, his chin resting on his chest, the bloody towels frozen to his stomach. "Mr. Rossi," Penelope hissed, dropping to her knees beside him. She slapped his cold cheek hard. "Matteo, wake up!" Matteo gasped, his eyes flying open in wild panic. He looked at Penelope, taking a moment to realize where he was. He was shivering violently now, the freezer's temperature dropping his core heat dangerously low, exacerbating the shock from the gunshot wound. "You're alive," Matteo whispered, genuinely astonished. "For now," Penelope said grimly. "But they'll figure out the alley is a dead end soon. We don't have much time." She ripped off a massive strip of the industrial duct tape with her teeth. "Lift your arms." Matteo gritted his teeth and complied. Penelope wrapped the thick silver tape entirely around his torso, securing the bloody towels tightly against his wound to act as a pressure dressing. Her hands were gentle but incredibly firm. As she leaned over him to wrap the tape around his back, Matteo felt the soft, warm curve of her stomach pressing against him. In his freezing, dying state, it was the most comforting, grounding thing he had ever felt. He could smell cheap vanilla lotion and the faint, nostalgic scent of fried onions on her skin. "Why?" Matteo breathed, his dark eyes searching her face. "Why are you risking your life for me? You know who I am." "Because a man shouldn't die alone on a dirty floor while people watch," Penelope said, simply tearing the tape and smoothing it down. "And because my nonna would haunt me if I let an Italian man freeze to death in a fry cooler." A weak, breathy chuckle escaped Matteo's lips, followed by a wince of pain. He reached up his bloody hand, weakly grasping the lapel of her pink uniform. He pulled her slightly closer. "What is your name?" "Angelo mio," he asked softly. "My angel." "Penelope," she replied, her voice softening for the first time. "Penelope Higgins." "Penelope." He tasted the name. "When I get out of this, I will not forget you, Penelope." Before Penelope could respond, the screech of multiple heavy vehicles sounded outside much louder than the hitmen's car. The heavy thud of car doors slamming shut echoed through the walls, followed immediately by the deafening rapid-fire staccato of automatic weapons. Matteo's eyes lit up with a dangerous fire, despite his pale skin. "Enzo," he whispered. "My brother. He found me." The gunfire outside lasted for only 30 agonizing seconds before silencing abruptly. A minute later, the diner doors burst open again. This time, it wasn't the Morettis. "Matteo!" a voice roared in Italian. "Find him! Tear this place apart!" Penelope stood up, her joints popping in the cold. She pulled Matteo's Glock from her apron pocket, placing it gently on the frozen boxes next to him. "Stay here," she said. She walked out of the freezer, her hands raised high in the air. The kitchen was suddenly swarming with men in dark suits, holding assault rifles. The man leading them, a slightly younger, fiercer version of Matteo, leveled his gun at Penelope's broad chest. "Where is he?" Enzo Rossi snarled. "In the freezer," Penelope said, calmly, not flinching at the gun pointed at her heart. "He's lost a lot of blood. He needs a hospital right now, or you're going to need a priest." Enzo stared at the fat waitress in the pink uniform, then pushed past her into the walk-in. "Fratello!" Enzo cried out. 10 minutes later, Matteo was loaded into the back of a heavily armored SUV, surrounded by a dozen of his most loyal men. As they secured him, he weakly pushed Enzo's hands away and pointed a bloody finger toward the diner door. Penelope stood on the curb in the freezing rain, her arms crossed over her chest, shivering as she watched them leave. Her apron was covered in a massive smear of Matteo's blood. Enzo walked over to her. He didn't sneer. He didn't look right through her. He looked at her with the utmost respect, pulling a thick black card with gold embossing from his jacket and pressing it into her hand. "My brother says you saved his life," Enzo said quietly. "The Rossi family is in your debt, Penelope Higgins. Call this number when you are ready to collect." As the black SUVs sped off into the rainy Philadelphia night, Penelope stood alone on the curb, the gold lettering on the card glinting under the neon diner sign. She looked down, at the bloody handprint on her waist, realizing her invisible life was over. 6 weeks dragged by. Rain washed the blood from the alley behind the diner, and life returned to its dreary rhythm. Penelope kept the embossed black card, hidden inside her cheap faux leather wallet, untouched. She had no intention of calling the Mafia. She just wanted to survive her shifts, pay her rent for her tiny walk-up on Tasker Street, and fade back into the comfortable invisibility of her daily routine. Unfortunately, visibility is a funny thing. Once the veil is pierced, it cannot be easily repaired. Stan fired her on a Tuesday. He claimed she was too slow, that her size was a liability during the morning rush. But Penelope knew the truth. Stan was terrified. He jumped at every shadow, convinced the Moretti family, or the Rossi syndicate, would return to tie up loose ends. By firing her, the cowardly manager hoped to sever his own ties to that brutal night. Unemployment hit hard. Rent was past due, and Penelope found herself surviving on cheap ramen and discounted bread from the corner bodega. She sat on her sagging sofa, one chilly Thursday evening, staring at the black card resting on her chipped coffee table. The gold lettering taunted her. Rossi. A heavy knock rattled her front door. Penelope frowned, pushing her heavy frame off the sofa. She wasn't expecting anyone, certainly not her landlord, who usually just slipped angry notes under the crack. She peered through the foggy peephole. Her blood ran ice-cold. Standing in the dim hallway was Dante, the Moretti hitman, with the snub-nosed revolver. Beside him was Carmine. They had realized her deception. Word on the street had likely confirmed that Matteo Rossi was recovering privately at his estate, heavily guarded, which meant he had survived the night he visited Pappy's diner. The trail had led right back to the fat waitress who played dumb. "Open up pork chop." Carmine's muffled voice slithered through the cheap wood. "We know you're in there. We just want to have a little chat about the night you suddenly forgot how to speak English." Panic seized her chest, but Penelope swallowed it down. She backed away toward the kitchen, her eyes darting around for a weapon. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. It was small comfort against guns, but she wasn't going to die cowering in a corner. The door splintered as Carmine kicked it. The deadbolt groaned. One more kick and the frame shattered. The two men stepped into the cramped apartment, their guns drawn. Dante smiled, a cruel, predatory stretching of his lips. "You caused us a lot of trouble, lady. Our boss is very unhappy that Rossi is still breathing, and since we can't get to him inside his fortress in Bryn Mawr, we figured we'd settle the score with the Broad, who hid him in a meat locker." Penelope raised the skillet, her hands trembling slightly, but her jaw was set. "Get out of my house." Dante laughed, raising his weapon, aiming it squarely at her chest. "Cute. Say hi to your nonna for me." Before Dante's finger could squeeze the trigger, the hallway outside exploded into violence. A suppressed gunshot coughed thwip, and Carmine's knee blew out in a mist of crimson. He screamed, collapsing to the cheap carpet. Dante spun around, firing blindly into the hall, but a massive figure in a tailored suit tackled him through the doorway, slamming him brutally against Penelope's drywall. The gun clattered across the linoleum. Penelope watched in stunned silence as Enzo Rossi pinned Dante by the throat, pressing the barrel of a Sig Sauer directly between the hitman's eyes. Behind them, stepping calmly over the groaning Carmine, was Matteo. He looked entirely different from the dying man in the diner. He wore a flawless navy blue canali suit, a silk pocket square tucked neatly over his chest, his dark hair perfectly styled. The only sign of his recent brush with death was the slight stiffness in his posture and the silver-handled cane he leaned on. "I told you I would not forget you, Penelope," Matteo said, his deep, rumbling voice filling the tiny apartment. He looked at Dante with absolute disgust. Kill them both. Leave the bodies in Moretti's driveway." "No," Penelope shouted, shocking everyone in the room. Matteo raised an eyebrow, motioning for Enzo to pause. "No. Not in my apartment," Penelope said, her chest heaving, the skillet still gripped tightly in her hand. "I won't have their blood staining my rug. My deposit is already completely gone." Matteo stared at her for a long, silent moment. Then a rich, genuine laugh erupted from his chest. It was a beautiful sound, warm and entirely unexpected. He looked at Enzo and nodded. Enzo hauled Dante to his feet, dragging him and the whimpering Carmine out of the apartment by their collars, tossing them to a crew of waiting men in the stairwell. Matteo stepped closer to Penelope, gently taking the heavy cast-iron pan from her hand and setting it on the counter. He looked down at her, his dark eyes tracing the soft curves of her face, the flush of her cheeks, the fierce, unyielding fire in her brown eyes. "You never called the number," Matteo observed softly. "I don't want Mafia money," Penelope replied, crossing her thick arms, trying to ignore how intensely he was staring at her. "I did what I did because it was right, not for a reward." "I know," Matteo said, his voice dropping an octave, stepping into her personal space. "That is exactly why I came to find you. The men in my world are loyal to my power, my money and my guns. You had nothing to gain and everything to lose, yet you stood between me and death. You carried me. You hid me." He reached out his warm, calloused fingers, gently touching her cheek. Penelope shivered. No man had ever touched her with such reverence. Usually men looked at her with disgust, or ignored her entirely, viewing her size as a barrier to humanity. Matteo looked at her as if she were a goddess carved from marble. "Pack a bag," Matteo commanded gently. "You are not safe here anymore. The Morettis know who you are. From this moment on, you are under my protection." "I can't just leave my life," she protested, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "What life?" Matteo asked, looking around the dilapidated apartment. "The job that fired you, the landlord who ignores you, the city that walks right past you. Penelope, you saved a king. It is time you lived like a queen." The Rossi estate in Bryn Mawr was a sprawling, gated compound of limestone and wrought iron. It was surrounded by ancient oak trees and heavily armed guards. For the first 2 months, Penelope felt like an imposter. She was given a massive suite with a huge bed silk robes that actually accommodated her wide hips and access to a private chef. The chef wept with pure joy when Penelope began teaching him her authentic Sicilian family recipes. Matteo was a constant and intoxicating presence in her new life. He did not hide her away like a shameful dark secret. Instead, he paraded her proudly. Their first public appearance was at a charity gala hosted at the Grand Union League of Philadelphia. This was a neutral ground where rival syndicates and corrupt politicians mingled freely over expensive champagne. Penelope was completely terrified. She wore a custom-made deep emerald gown that flowed elegantly over her curves. Her hair was swept up in a sophisticated twist. When Matteo walked in with her on his strong arm, the ballroom went dead silent. Penelope could feel the judgmental stares of the thin Mafia wives. She heard their vicious and cruel whispers perfectly well. "Look at the massive size of her. She is incredibly huge. What is the Don doing with a blimp? Is this a sick joke?" Penelope wanted to shrink to look at the floor and to make herself as invisible as possible. But Matteo tightened his grip on her thick waist. He leaned in close, his warm lips brushing her ear. "Keep your head up right now," he whispered fiercely into her ear. "They whisper because they are starving, weak, and entirely replaceable. You are none of those things. You are the strongest woman in this entire room. Let them look." Penelope took a deep breath, squaring her broad shoulders. She lifted her chin confidently, locking eyes with a sneering socialite, until the smaller woman looked away in absolute submission. Matteo smiled proudly, kissing her cheek in front of the entire underworld. That night marked a massive shift. The Rossi family men treated Penelope with absolute reverence. They called her Donna Penelope. They opened doors for her, asked her advice, and respected her sharp mind. But the Moretti family was not finished yet. A peace summit was arranged exactly 3 weeks later. It was held at a private high-end Italian restaurant in Center City. Matteo Enzo and Penelope attended meeting with Don Moretti to negotiate a permanent ceasefire. The tension in the room was completely suffocating. Penelope sat quietly at the grand table sipping her cold water. She noticed things that others missed easily. She was very used to observing people while fading into the background. She watched the Moretti servers closely. They were sweating profusely. Their eyes kept darting toward the exits. When the massive silver platter of veal saltimbocca was brought out, the head waiter placed it directly down. He set it right in front of Matteo. The hand of the waiter was shaking violently. "Eat now, Matteo," Don Moretti smiled, revealing a greasy grin. "Let us break bread and end this war tonight." Matteo picked up his silver fork, nodding graciously. "Stop right there." The voice of Penelope cracked like a loud whip across the silent room. Matteo froze instantly, his fork inches from the meat. Everyone stared at her. "What is the meaning of this rude outburst?" Don Moretti growled, his ugly face flushing red. "Control your fat whore, Rossi." Enzo stood up quickly, his hand going straight to his hidden weapon. Penelope simply sat and stared. Can you believe how Penelope turned the tables on the entire Mafia underworld, using the exact thing they judged her for? Her incredible observation skills and fierce courage proved that true power doesn't come in a specific size. If you loved this intense, twist-filled romance about an underestimated heroine claiming her crown, smash that like button, share it with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories.